Welcome to the Patriot Perspective. I am Gregory Lykov, and I'm joined here with my friend.
Hello, my name's Ofer Adar. Welcome to August 1st's episode.
Yeah, today is a wonderful day for America and a wonderful day for the world. We have a lot of news to cover. Today, we're going to be discussing everything from the current situation with the tariffs in the United States to going all the way to Gaza and the situation in Israel. Our episode will be filled with commentary, and I'm just excited to get started. Let's get this new month in with a new month and a new podcast. Okay, so let's get straight in. The first thing I want to discuss is the current trade situation. This has been any other word than epic would not describe it correctly. I mean, what Donald Trump has
Absolutely.
done, in the last month with all the trade deals, and then today he is closing those trade deal doors and just imposing the tariffs. And we see all his Truth Social posts about it. I want to ask your thoughts on it. Like, what do you think this is going to do? Will this increase American prosperity, decrease it? Share your thoughts.
Yeah, so we look at the fact that Trump set a very clear deadline for August 1st, and that was for a whole host of countries that were unable to secure trade deals. And that spans from Southeast Asia to countries in Africa, South America, India, the list goes on. And so now that deadline is passed, and that means that he's upping the ante, and that the consequences are going to be even higher for the countries that don't agree and aren't able to really negotiate in good faith and change a lot of their rules that were completely unfair to the United States, at least in Trump's perspective, whether you look at the fact that there was a pretty large trade deficit that Trump is completely against, or you look at the fact that countries like India have a lot of trade barriers, like import duties, or a lot of things related to intellectual property that hurt American companies operating in said countries. So he wants to fix all of those concerns and put it all into one sort of deal that will then eventually decrease tariffs, but not completely remove them. So the big drama right now in relation to the trade deals that have not been secured mainly focuses on India because with India, they are big when it comes to textiles and IT, and they make it very difficult for the United States to import their goods into India. So in a way, they've actually been one of the strictest countries to the US even before Trump put in the tariffs on Liberation Day. And now they're trying to do the same thing and reciprocate against Trump's threats of raising it. First, it was like 25, now it's 35%. So the numbers are just continuing to go up. And Trump's tying it to the fact that India buys oil from Russia. And that also ties into Brazil because there's currently a lot of negotiations going on with Brazil and their unfair trade practices. So those are the two big sticking points. And the deadlines for those countries would be on August 7th. So he set the deadline back by a week, and then there are going to be even higher consequences. And same thing with like Thailand, Cambodia, Bangladesh, whatever it may be.
Yeah.
And then China, there's an indefinite period of extension because obviously that's going to be the most important trade deal secured given the high amount of volume. But so far, with the ones that have been secured, which have largely been American allies, very close allies, and not adversaries or neutral countries, they have been very good from every single perspective. I think you would agree on that. And I'd like to know what you think about the
Yeah.
prospects for future trade agreements with the countries that I listed.
Yeah, well, I'll be sure to share my thoughts, but I actually first had a question for you, Ofer.
Sure,
Why
yeah.
would India care? Why does India need a trade deal with the United States? If India is one of the biggest producers in the world, it is a developing nation right now. It has a huge population. So why does it need the United States as a marketplace?
Well, because of the trade deficit between India and the United States, India is the one sending all their products to the United States, and they want to have that market open to them. They benefit immensely from that. There's a whole lobby in Washington, D.C. of like Indian politicians and ethnic Indians that try to push forward for Indian interests. And they're lobbying very heavily right now for a couple of things. First of all, obviously a favorable trade deal and not very high tariffs, despite the fact that, apples, like quite literally like fruit apples, there's like a 70% import duty on them when American apples go into their country
Yeah.
because they want to protect their own industry. Obviously, they're a developing country. So they hate it when the United States does the same thing. But, you can't like give what you can't take. Like it's just completely absurd. So you look at that and you look at the fact that they're also lobbying for H-1B visas, which are these visas that go into like employing Indian nationals into a lot of important American companies like Google and IBM and Microsoft. So they really like that because then those Indians, they come back to India after a couple of years and they boost the economy there and they send remittances. So they have a huge interest in maintaining good relations with the United States. But at the same time, they're trying to diversify. They're trying to keep all their contacts open, including with Russia, which is why they buy the weapons from there, like the Su-57. They want to do that deal
Yeah.
rather than buying the F-35s from the United States. And they like buying the Russian cheap energy. And they also like to a certain degree having economic relations with China, but not as much. So obviously, the United States views that as a threat, and that's why they're linking Russian energy purchases to a deal with India.
Yeah, definitely. It's very similar with Germany actually before when Germany was almost fully reliant on Russian energy, and then only after the EU sanctioned Russia
Yeah.
significantly after the Ukraine war, Germany was forced to stop its reliance on Russian oil. But again, a big reason of the Ukrainian of the cause of the Ukraine war was because of Joe Biden's energy policies, where he
Yeah.
decided to uh, quite literally shut down the giving of fracking licenses and fracking in the United States for 90 days, for a period of 90 days, which is huge. 90 days in a oil industry could make it or break it. Just look at, you know,
Yeah.
to compare, if anyone remembers when the Suez Canal was blocked by that ship Evergreen, that was for
Yeah.
what, 2 weeks or something, and the entire world collapsed. So it's a very similar situation with oil, and that was for 90 days. So obviously, Russia increased their oil prices, and countries like Germany, which were previously buying a little bit from Russia and a little bit from the US, along with other countries, now at that period solely relied on Russian oil. Russia was got very wealthy in that period, and you know the story from there. So really, people actually, I was in a debate with Harry Sisson about this exact issue, and
Really?
he thought I was
Ooh.
completely crazy. He thought I was when I brought this point up, when I brought the point
Mhm.
of Joe Biden, stopping the oil industry. He thought I was crazy. I don't think it's crazy. I don't know. Do you think it's crazy, Ofer?
No, obviously not. And then the consequence was that in 2022, 2023, Biden had to open up the Strategic Petroleum Reserve
Yeah.
and deplete something
And
that's
half of
critical to
it,
our
he
national
spent
security.
exactly. He spent half of the oil in the reserve for his
Yeah,
mistake, and that's why we didn't feel a big issue with it. But can you imagine what if, let's say, the conflict in Iran occurred under Joe Biden? If that
that
happened,
would have been
then
horrible.
yeah, not only will oil prices have skyrocketed, but our country's security as the, global superpower would have definitely gotten revoked. I believe.
Yeah, it
Yeah,
would be under immense strain because, the United States and the dollar is backed to a certain degree by OPEC in the way in which they're able to produce
exactly.
oil consistently from Saudi Arabia, Qatar, etc. Iran cuts that off, and then
Yeah.
that's a massive loss for American allies.
Yeah, exactly. And also to mention, what Trump has been doing, what a lot of people kind of comment on the fact that oil licenses and leases were
Yeah.
given under the Biden administration, or leases specifically. Sorry, oil licenses, fracking licenses were given more under the
Mhm.
Biden administration than the Trump administration. But what people don't point to is the fact that Biden gave out less than 25% of the oil leases, which actually leased land, than the Trump administration. There's this wonderful book that Oprah once recommended to me by Alex Epstein.
Yeah,
Uh,
right.
yeah, so that book actually goes in depth of why it's not just the
Mhm.
licenses. That doesn't matter. It's about the leases. It goes
Mhm.
there's much more to the oil industry than just giving out fracking licenses. Because if you have a fracking license but no land to actually frack on it, then what the hell does that license do for you? It doesn't do anything. And
Yeah,
that's what we
he
saw.
talked about he
Yeah.
talked about it actually. Like there was a couple of major things that he did incorrectly Biden, even when he just got in. Keystone Pipeline, destroying
Mhm.
that with Canada. Alaskan offshore drilling, destroying that, and
Would you
then
like to
not
talk about the
allowing.
Keystone Pipeline's environmental impacts?
Sure, sure. And then the fracking on federal lands, banning that. So those were just horrible policies
Yeah.
all around.
And Trump revoked those policies, thank God. And we have seen a big increase in the amount of fracking licenses and leases given out under the Trump administration. Of course, what people will point to always, like the Harry Sissons in the world, oh, but it takes 3 years for fracking to actually begin, or whatever, all of that crap. Yes, it does. It takes 3 years, but the oil industry's prices are based on not the fracking in 3 years. It's based on what will happen in 3 years. We don't price our goods based on the current situation. If we have a huge supply of goods, but we know that in a year all of those goods are going to go away, then we're going to price our goods pretty high. I mean, look at that. Look at what happened in COVID during the toilet paper crisis. Very similar story. That's why oil prices are down because of Trump. It's pretty amazing what he has been able to do. But to kind of transition back on topic with ex India, India
Yeah.
plays a big role in oil prices because India, whoever they buy from, uh, pretty much gets a what two one over a billion population, like over 1/8 of the
Yeah.
population in the entire world.
1.5 billion is
Yeah,
crazy.
and India is one of the largest consumers of oil. They consume a lot of oil because of their huge population and their developing economy. A lot of environmentalists would tell you that that's why their pollution is so bad, which is true, actually. Yes, that is true. But what India is doing is it's instead of buying from the US, which naturally does have more expensive oil prices at this time than Russia because Russia is able to Russia is in this case needs to sell to someone, so India is a big market for them. Uh,
Yeah.
but what I would like to see is Trump actually put Indian reliance on oil to the United States. That would be massive. That would be a huge, huge success. Can he do it? I don't know, but there's definitely a potential there. If he's trying to threaten the entire trade with India or what threatening to put a what 25% tariff on Indian goods, then that could do it. That could actually make India transition. But I don't know. I'm excited to see more in the future, but we also have to look at other players like China. China produces a lot of its own oil too, if I'm not mistaken. It also produces a lot of minerals and everything like that. So I wanted to ask, is there a threat of China's production of rare earths, minerals, all of this stuff, along with their consumer production goods like cars and any all the other, gadgets?
Yeah. Of course there is. It's a huge concern, and it only gets compounded by the Belt and Road Initiative, which expanded its tentacles into much of Southeast Asia. We saw it manifest
Nigeria.
in exactly, yeah,
Yeah.
literally like 70% of Africa has some sort of footprint of the Belt and Road Initiative, and there are like a couple of major examples in South America as well. Panama was a part of it, but then Trump pressured them out of it at the
Yes.
beginning of his administration. That was really good. So that has to continue. The United States has to assert itself as an energy dominant superpower and also as a country that's able to export a lot of products that China could potentially really compete with us for. The problem is obviously the fact that they're going to be naturally blessed with the rare earth minerals. And, you have to get around that. That's why there was the deal with Ukraine. Obviously, that's not going to like make up for it entirely, but that's part of Trump's thinking. It's why he's also generally supportive of Taiwan and the way in which they can benefit the United States and the global market through semiconductors. So yeah, there's a lot of moving parts to it. But yeah, it is a massive threat to America's dominance on the economic scale. The fact that China is expanding its tentacles in a peaceful way and doing so very discreetly. And over time, that becomes a huge issue if it's not addressed while it's still developing.
Yeah, and they're doing it in a way which much of the Western world actually agrees with, surprisingly, the public at least. Because what the public see is a country like China, a huge developing country with so much money, going into these poor communities, building it up, and yeah, maybe taking a little bit of oil in return as a thank you. That is not what's happening at all. What China is doing is they're going into these developing countries. Nigeria is just an example that I love to use because look at it right now. It's one of the most corrupt totally, uh, you know, collapsing countries. Look at their freedom index score. Their freedom index score, I'm pretty sure, is like 21 or something, the lowest of the low, one of the
Yeah.
most unstable countries right now, along with Iran, actually, especially with the recent situation with Iran.
Yeah.
It's pretty funny. But
Mhm.
they go into these countries, and because Nigeria, for example, is so oil rich, it's a very big asset for China. And they go in, they take their oil, they develop it a little bit, and they kind of just trash their economy, and it turns into a renter state. And when a country turns into a renter state, then it just relies 100% on oil. That's a big issue that people have to understand because look at Nigeria now. Like, what if that oil disintegrates? or something, then Nigeria's entire economy collapses. So I think that China is taking advantage of these countries, obviously. Do I think that the US necessarily needs to get involved with Nigeria, for example? I don't know. I think that their oil assets would provide significant benefit to the United States, but definitely canceling the Belt and Road Initiative in countries closer to the United States, like Panama, as you stated.
Yeah,
And
huge
uh,
deal.
what do you think of Mexico? Do you think that that would ever be a contender for the Belt and Road Initiative?
Yeah, absolutely. China and Canada actually, like they've been building up a lot of interesting relationships in recent years,
That is,
economically speaking, and then
yeah,
also educationally, right?
educationally, and also Canada in general has been positioning itself away from the US interests. Israel's a perfect example, which I'm going to get into later into this podcast, but Canada has definitely been taking a step back from Israel and just in general the Western world, and the kind of the threat that we see here as Canada is renowned as, oh, the US is closest ally. Well, that's not true. It's not only partnering with China, but it's partnering with other players in the Middle East and like OPEC, for example. And also Canada is doing something very interesting where they're uh, like I think you could talk about this actually, their situation in the Ukraine war. They're almost acting as
Yeah.
an EU nation rather than an American ally, if that makes sense.
It is interesting because in effect they operate as if they're a part of the EU and like their policy. It's very similar. You have like a neoliberal leader, Mark Carney, and it was a big deal during the election that he had business dealings in China.
Yeah.
So he's like really interconnected with them. And since then he's been very flattering
Yeah, I
to
mean, we want
China.
Trudeau back.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So this is also a problem with the EU, but the fact that like in recent years, Chinese exports have been coming into the
Yeah.
EU and they've been largely reliant on the Chinese markets, as has most of the world, obviously, as China is the number one trading partner for a lot of these countries. But with the EU, it's particularly concerning because, they used to make up a huge share of the global GDP. Now it's going down, and in general, the European market is beginning to wane either way because it is supposed to be the closest sort of American assets in the world. It is good that there was a deal established that helped the United States rekindle that relationship through investment, through less trade barriers for the United States, and then tariffs, obviously, which benefit the United States and the American workforce. So really, that ties together from an energy perspective and military perspective, and that's going to hurt China's standing in those regions. And I think it's because the EU sort of realizes that there is a close connection between Russia and China, and some of it was intentional due to like the way in which Russia was pushed out of the sort of European community in the early 2000s. But at this point, it doesn't even matter. At this point, the relationship is getting closer, and perhaps they realize that, and that's why they're willing to go back to the United States, even though a lot of these leaders they don't personally like Trump.
Yeah, exactly. And I think Mexico has to be mentioned here because this has been
Yeah,
talked about a lot by Trump, why Mexico is a threat to the United States. Obviously, he complains that the southern border isn't protected, the fentanyl, which are huge issues. And by the way, China is a significant player in the fentanyl industry. The entire reason why countries like Mexico can make fentanyl is because they're buying goods from China to make those fentanyl products. So China is the real issue with that. But to go back to Mexico, they have lived on this economic basis that they are going to produce for the United States. They are going to have companies that are going to pay significantly less than the companies that operate in the United States, and they would basically offshore it in the northern
yeah,
parts of Mexico. That's why if you look at like a map of wealth throughout Mexico per capita, the northern parts of Mexico are always the richest because they're closest to the US border, they have factories there and everything. But now, because Mexico is beginning to develop and is now a pretty much developed country, a very strong global superpower, I think it's in the top 10 or top 15 of the top GDPs per country. I believe I think in,
it's up there.
yeah,
Certainly
I
like top
forgot.
25 at least.
Yeah, I would look into it more. I remember I forgot the specific number, but anyways, they are transitioning from a manufacturing economy to one of intellectual property. Those are much more valuable economies. The US isn't a manufacturing. We don't really manufacture.
Yeah, we're a
We
service economy.
yeah,
Yeah.
we're a service economy. We do a lot of intellectual things like Apple, for example, software, all of that stuff. It's a much more valuable economy. That's what China is also transitioning into, and that's why they're so big right now. They're again going from the manufacturing into those service sectors, which are very, very, very difficult to manage with the United States because if we have another competitor like China, which produces wonderful software, steals all intellectual data from the United States, if we
Yeah.
have that, then that will certainly ruin the United States as a whole. And that's why China is really a big threat. And Mexico is doing it right next to us. So, number one, what's going to happen is companies are going to get out of Mexico because it's not going to be cheap for them anymore to manufacture goods. It's the prices are going to be too high. They're going to look for nations like Cambodia, for example. Cambodia is very cheap right now. Vietnam, I don't want to say Cuba. No, I'm kidding, not Cuba. But
Maybe one day after the
yeah,
communist
after the
government.
communists, well, actually, if they make a deal with the federal government, they'll get free workers. So I'm sure that would work for them. But
Yeah.
they're offshoring to other countries instead of Mexico. That's why Mexico is going through a transitioning period. But if we have a competitor in intellectual property in service economy sector right next to us, that poses a lot of risks. And that also means that Mexico wouldn't be fully reliant on the United States anymore. And Ofer, I'm curious, why is it important for Mexico, for the United States perspective, to be fully reliant on the US?
Well, that's how it should be with countries that are on your border. Like if you're a global superpower, just naturally the countries next to you should be basically satrapies. Like
Yeah,
that's the way that Russia treats the countries that are on its border that they have the ability to pressure in that way, unless they're in NATO, and then it's a completely different situation. But like look at the relationship between Russia and Kazakhstan, for instance, and the way in which they're very,
Belarus.
yeah, and the way in which like they go around treating energy in a very close manner. Problem with Mexico, there are a lot of problems actually with Mexico right now, whether it be related to we're able to smuggle fentanyl into the United States previously, or the fact that there are a lot of expats now that are living in Mexico City and it actually pissed off the locals and they started protesting against them because the cost of living is like soaring through the roof in the cities. So they have a lot of like modernization issues that they're dealing with right now. China's obviously going to spread their influence into that area in the same way that they feel threatened by the United States having close alliances with Vietnam and to a certain degree Thailand, which is pretty close to their border, and especially in Taiwan, South Korea, etc. That's the same way that we feel in the cases where China is trying to now try to like improve their standing economically in
Yeah,
Canada and Mexico. It's not military or anything like that, but it is a really important economic
exactly.
base. And yeah, what we were saying about the way in which they're on the border, that you're naturally going to trade the most with the countries that border you
Mhm.
because you could just go through rail or highways and Mexico is very important agriculturally. So yeah, we need to be really ensuring that we still have close relationships with them. And we don't see that there is progress in the trade deals with those two countries, Canada and Mexico, so
Mhm.
far. I hope that changes.
In a more interesting manner, I wanted to ask you about your thoughts in the situation in Gaza. In general, as an overview, this war has been going on for what feels like years, and what has been years. But a lot of people are asking, what will be the end of it? When will we see a final finish? What will Israel's goal be? Because it should have already wiped out
Mhm.
Hamas. Why hasn't it? All of these questions are being asked right now. And I wanted to ask you, what do you think the end of this war will look like, and when will it be? And most importantly, what is after it? What is the solution?
Yeah, that's the most asked question, and rightly so. The problem is that the Israelis are constrained by two factors. First of all, the fact that there are still hostage negotiations going on, the fact that there are 20 live hostages and 30 dead ones, that there's a lot of pressure from internally Israelis to release them.
Yeah.
Obviously, that's going to be a restraint that Israel has that prevents it from going all out and trying to enter into certain areas and just completely stopping to negotiate. They have to negotiate to a certain degree in order to release those people if that's their goal. So that's one issue. The other issue is in relation to manpower. A lot of manpower issues were experienced, and there's a lot of fatigue, wartime fatigue after obviously what has it been like? It's nearly been 2 years, or it's nearly going to be, yeah, nearly 2 years. I can't believe it. It's insane. When you look, there was a war in Lebanon, a full-scale war in Lebanon. IDF soldiers are still operating in Syria to a certain degree. There are raids in the West Bank. So obviously they're thinned out, and the process of mobilizing people, calling up reservists, it gets very tiring after a certain period of time. So even right now, we're like on paper, the Israelis were supposed to have 5 divisions on the ground in Gaza. In reality, they only have 8 brigades, which is like a tiny fraction of that because a lot of the brigades that are within the divisions are just sent home after a while. So they're scaling back activity right now because there's been a deadlock in negotiations and because there are a lot of soldiers that are tired. But the next steps are being considered right now. And we're at a crossroads, obviously, in relation to what will be considered. There's the route that has been talked about by France, by the United Kingdom, and Canada of getting a negotiated settlement, ending the war. They say that they want to disarm Hamas, but they don't explain how they're going to do it. They're just idealistic about it. And
Yeah.
then there's going to be just a complete hostage deal between both sides. That's one perspective that a lot of people support right now, and there's a lot of pressure about it. Another perspective would be to restart offensive activities in order to pressure Hamas into a partial ceasefire deal and then just continuing to get the ball rolling. And that would really drag out for months, if not years, at that point. Or you could go all out and try to completely take over Gaza, forget about even trying to negotiate for hostage release, and then from there, completely destroying Hamas's military capabilities, having a military control over all of Gaza, and then from there transitioning it into a new governing style, which is also going to be pretty costly, but and it's also going to take a certain amount of time, but it would completely solve the issue of Hamas existing on Israel's border, which is an existential threat and a huge threat to the communities living nearby. So that's something that the right wing in Israel is really pushing for.
Yeah, and just to remind viewers, the current situation in Israel is very divided because Israel is a democratic and not apartheid, but democratic state, something that people will refuse to acknowledge. They have a lot of dissent, and there's a lot of protests, obviously, about what the significant, the Israeli government should do. There's a lot of questions on whether Israel should advocate or have a ceasefire now for the hostages or forget about them. Excuse my language, but that's the truth.
Yeah.
Because, obviously Israelis are and Americans are morally attached to these hostages because we have been hearing their stories everywhere. It's been so impactful. And while that's all, it's truly very sad. The other question is, okay, let's say we have a ceasefire now and we get released all the hostages and give time for Hamas to rebuild and then just create another October 7th where another thousand something people die.
Yeah.
Like what option is it works? Both of them are horrible options, obviously, but I know that the Israeli government cannot sacrifice another however many terrorist attacks for this one. It's just not something that's feasible. But at the same time, we can't leave someone behind in Gaza. That's not how the Israeli government works. So that's why the situation is so confusing. It is very, very, very questionable of what exactly will happen. How exactly will the war finish? But something else that's interesting is what will happen after. When Israel finishes the war, let's say Hamas gets eradicated, or let's say um, the US has a deal with Hamas where Hamas will not be in power anymore. And the US takes over, something like that. Whether the UAE takes over, there's a lot of talk with that too. But if Hamas doesn't gain power, if Hamas is, sits down from their throne, what will happen next in Gaza? Will there just be another election of another Hamas, or would there be Israeli control again? What would happen?
Well, from an Israeli perspective, what would have to happen first is, at least for a certain period of time, Israeli military occupation. Israeli forces basically administering the region. And military rule is something that has happened in the past. If you look at Israel's history, up until 1967, the Arab Israelis that were living there were under like military rule and martial law. So that only changed after 19 years. So there is experience also in the West Bank, similar sort of scenario with dealing with large populations. And the reason why it would have to be necessary is because there's the fear that then groups would fester and try to rebuild and try to restart attacks. So there has to be like initially a phase of just calming everything down, and then from there beginning to gradually open up the civilian control over certain portions of the Gaza Strip. And that's where you brought it in, the United Arab Emirates participating in either a governance effort or rebuilding efforts. And there are a lot of countries that are proposing to get involved in this. and they would want to do it because it looks good for them, and it's also a way to increase their soft power in the region. So Saudi Arabia, Qatar, they're all talking about that as an option. Then from there, how would a government form? It would probably have to be a technocratic government, like taking key officials that are from the UAE and people that are trained by the UAE and having them sort of like operate there and try to create a moderate system. That would be the like idealistic hope. I don't know how feasible it is. And they would probably also use some of the local Gazan tribes that are currently collaborating with Israel, like Yasser Abu Shabab, to have control over the civilian security. And he's already building up like a government apparatus in Israeli controlled parts of Gaza with his
Yeah.
allies and their families. So that's like a model for how it's going to have to look for the entirety of the strip. But I do think that's if that actually reaches that point, and then a lot of people will also be able to migrate out. And that's due to the utter devastation. And it's going to take a while to fix all of that and get it in order.
Yeah, and there's been a lot of talk of what exactly the Gaza population would do. You kind of alluded to it, whether it's migrating or not. But the US a few months ago already, when it met with Netanyahu in the White House, they alluded to something of a voluntary removal of Gazans from the Gaza Strip, something like you know what I'm talking about. But
Yeah,
how
yeah, I know what you're talking
feasible
about.
is that? Is that really going to happen? Was that just a scare tactic? What was that? Like,
I think it was, yeah, you're right. It probably was a scare tactic to get Hamas to be more receptive to certain deals because the alternative would be, okay, half the population is going to leave. But that was never really a realistic possibility
yeah,
without a country that would be willing to host them. And
yeah,
even now, we don't have a country that's willing to host that number of people. Even in France, I think we're going to talk about them. There was this one girl who was coming from Gaza and she was going to enroll in a university. And she actually got kicked out because she was writing like all these anti-Semitic comments and like actually like calling
that
to
story,
violence.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
that
That's
story was
crazy.
actually it was broken by the Allgemeiner, which is the outlet I work
Mhm.
for their newsletter. They're the ones who released it. They're the ones who reported on it first. And it's insane that you bring it up because for this week's newsletter, I read the newsletter for the CEO every week, and he asked me to exactly write about the story. So it was an
Wow.
insane thing. Yeah.
Mhm.
So exactly like it happened in France, it happens in a lot of other countries, but also if we look at Jordan, which for a period in time did host a lot of Palestinian refugees in
Yeah.
refugee camps, uh, we saw that in those camps, that number one, obviously funding is a major issue. It costs a lot of money to host them, but also they're number one places where terrorist ideals spread. That's how, when you get an environment that's unruly, that's not uh, enjoyable for those people to live in, and there's radicals that live in there. That's how ISIS, gets their members. That's how all of these
Yeah.
other regions get their members because that's how you get radical people to agree with you. So what ISIS camps in other parts like Syria, for example, Syria also used to have them, and Iraq even has them. So it's an example of even if a country did agree to host them, it would probably not end up well. It will end up in another
Oh, yeah,
terrible
absolutely.
army.
It would be a bad idea for any country willing to accept them.
Yeah.
Maybe a country that wants to like decrease their labor shortage would be desperate and then would agree to it. But again, there
What
hasn't been any
country,
proof.
what country would even want to, number one, de decrease their labor shortage? Number two, I 100% I could agree with, I think you agree with me too. The cost of aid, the cost of housing for these people are going to be
Yeah, yeah.
significantly more than anything that they contribute into the economy.
It would
So,
have to be subsidized by America.
yeah.
And why would America want to do that? That's not in America's interests.
Well, in part, yes, and in part, no. So this is what I think. This is my theory of this entire rehousing thing. What I think is going to happen after the war is someone is obviously going to have to control the U.S. I mean, not the U.S., Gaza.
Yeah.
It could either be the U.S. or it could be a country like the UAE, Qatar, something like that. If it's the U.S., great. It will cost the U.S. a bunch of money. It will be very bad for U.S. taxpayers. But US gains more influence in the Middle East. Who doesn't want US to gain influence in the Middle East? Countries like Qatar, the UAE doesn't want, Saudi Arabia, no one wants more influence from the US. So I guess as an incentive to prevent the US from gaining more influence, I believe the Trump administration could offer a deal something like this. We get involved or another country takes responsibility for these people. So if something like that happens, if another country takes responsibility, it would be a win-win. Number one, no US involvement, and number two, it will not cost US taxpayers. It's wonderful. But the question here is how much these countries really care about US involvement. We already have Israel, so what more US involvement? Why would we care? Do you think these countries
Yeah. Well, you look at it, Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar is an American air base. It's really important for power projection against Iran, for instance. So I don't think they have a problem necessarily with like the United States having some influence there, as long as they're influencing the United States as well. That's a
yes.
big part of why Qatar donated the Air Force One, the new one, to the United
And
States.
donated the whatever 9 billion or $19 billion to the airbase too under Biden, but no
Yeah.
one talked about it.
Yeah.
No one, everyone was silent. Oh, that no one cares. But
Yeah, and that's why they're investing in the United States as well. They want to have the United States on their good side. Same thing with Saudi Arabia and UAE. There are American bases there as well. So yeah, they would be fine taking over Gaza and they have the money to do so. They would also be able to get PR points with their population for like solving the humanitarian crisis. And they would be helping out Israel. And Israel is already building relations with some of those countries in the Abraham Accords. So it would help push things further in that regard as well. So I
yeah,
think that's probably the most likely option if Hamas is willing to relinquish control, which they obviously aren't, or they're forcibly going to be kicked out, which is going to take a lot of effort, like monetarily speaking, and also through manpower. So,
yeah.
it's a long road ahead, I think.
And Ofer, just one more question about this topic.
Yeah.
People are asking why this war is taking so long. If we wanted to eradicate Hamas, why didn't we do it a year ago? Why is it taking this long? Why is Israel not doing it faster? Can you answer that?
Yeah, I'll give a long list of reasons. Hostages, number one reason, because then you have to go back and forth on ceasefire negotiations. And then also you can't go into certain areas because you're scared the hostages are going to be there and they can die. Second of all, the cynical use of civilian infrastructure by Hamas. 500 kilometers plus of tunnels, underpopulated areas, upwards of 40 to 60% of each house within war zones, within embattled neighborhoods, being mined, having IEDs at the entrances to
Yeah.
windows or doors. So then you have to go through and individually clear out those houses, and that takes time. It drags out. And then because Hamas was able to sort of really adjust their tactics, they are able to do these hit and runs while the IDF is focused on destroying infrastructure. That's another issue. The fact that there were manpower shortages because there was a seven front war, obviously, meant that IDF was forced to go into certain neighborhoods, fight there for a couple of weeks, and then leave. And then during the time that they left, Hamas was able to go back in and rebuild its infrastructure, mine new areas, and continue fighting and controlling the civilian population there. So then there was a back and forth, whack-a-mole basically going on for about a year until the IDF got serious in certain neighborhoods. But even now, there are two huge clusters of Gaza that are still controlled by Hamas, the central parts and Gaza City. So going in there is going to be very costly, and there's still the consideration from the international community and the pressure going on, and the hostages, and the fact that soldiers are tired. So when you combine it together, like you understand why it's very difficult.
Yeah, and not only that, under the Biden administration, there was a lot of pressure for Israel not to go into certain areas. The best example is Rafah, obviously, uh,
Yeah.
how Biden condemned and threatened to dec or completely dismantle their aid to Israel, all of that stuff in Rafah, and then we turn out that there's hostages there. So when these things happen, when the Israel is pressured, and Rafah is not the only example, by the way, there's hundreds of examples of not only the US, but of all its allies. When those issues happen, then yes, they're going to be thinking twice before they go into a certain area. That double thinking is a big issue. And let's go into the issue of in general of the international world and the international world uh, condemning Israel as a whole. Just this week, we saw that Canada announced that it will recognize the state of Palestine unless Israel agrees to a ceasefire. We saw that the UK did the same thing. We even saw that Canada thought to donate, sorry, I don't want to say donate, fund the PLO in millions of dollars, give millions of dollars to the
Yeah.
PLO. And the question is why? The question is, why would they do that?
Yeah.
Well, according to them, they want to prevent or foster the environment of a ceasefire. So they want to make it so Israel has to agree to a ceasefire. Well, to that question, like I'm not understanding it very clearly. Are you telling me that Israel should be threatened by your recognition of Palestine as a state? Like, why do we care? If Canada recognizes Palestine as a state, I mean, yes, it provides some legitimacy, but it's not anything new. Like Canada has always had a history of doing this type of backhandedness to Israel. Just in
Yeah.
the 1948 charter, when Israel was created, actually in the town that I live in and you used to live in, that's where Israel was created because the
Cool.
UN was being renovated in the city, so they came to Long
Yeah.
Island. But when that charter was actually being passed, Canada abstained to vote on it. So they chose not to vote with the U.S. And this goes a long history of Canada kind of just ignoring Israel as a whole, preventing any intervention with them. It also it goes to show of Canada's overall neutrality that's really backhanded to US interests because we're thinking of Canada as the country that is most supportive of the US and that the US most relies on out of all allies. But Ofer, let me ask you, how much of that is really true? Do we really need Canada? Is it really the best friend of the United States right now?
Right now, with the current dynamics between Donald Trump and Carney, probably not. In an ideal world, like you go back into history, and you would say it's probably in America's best interests to have good relations with a huge country on its northern border. They come from the same kin pretty much with
Yep.
being colonies of the United Kingdom. So there's a historic connection. And the fact that for most of like the 20th century, you had close relations as they were part of NATO together and were operating together in the war on terror in Iraq, Afghanistan, etc. So like there's always been like a close connectedness between Canada and the United States. But we talked about it. We talked about how China is beginning to increase their influence over there. And, Canada has always been a more liberal country. It's been less, I suppose, the disposition of Canadians as a society has been less freedom oriented. That's my view based on the people they elect, Trudeau, etc. And, the fact that they don't have the same sort of protections for speech, for Second Amendment that the United States has. So there are differences, obviously.
Well,
And
let's
then
not
they could also
stereotype
manifest in
Canadians.
Palestine.
Well, let's not stereotype Canadians because if you
Yeah,
go
I'm sorry. I love Canadians. Yeah.
well, to be honest, if you go into Americans, they probably think of us of gun owning people, all of that. In reality, I'm sure Canadians in general are very kind, but are they electing people that obviously are less on freedom and more on uh, communism? Yes. So, look, if that's a good example of what Canada is doing, then so be it. But I'm interested to see what they're going to do. We have our own communist mayor in New York City. Well, going to be communist mayor in New York City, which I'm excited to see. But yeah, in general, I think that there's a big emphasis of Canadians and Canada in general of not really caring about their rights. They don't have a constitution like the United States does of such
Yeah.
inalienable rights. They don't really care that much. And that's a lot of the Western world. That's why we see countries like France in the same exact position as Canada right now. And even the UK, you could say, obviously, it's a different system of government
Yeah.
than the
Yeah.
US, but it's very similar to Canada right now and France. All of them are very questionably turning on US interests, which I find very interesting. I want to, continue watching the situation, but look, it's late for Ofer right now. I don't want to keep him up, but we'll be sure to uh, post our next episode quite soon. Have a great weekend, and Ofer, if you want to add any final thoughts, please.
Yeah. Thank you guys so much. We're going to increase the frequency. There are going to be some very interesting interviews coming up in the
Very,
near
very
future.
soon.
I know Greg's very excited for it as well.
Yes.
So thank you all.
Yeah, thank you.